Good afternoon. Welcome. We're excited to have everybody here. I'm David DeWitt, Trade Relations Manager with the Oregon Wine Board, and we're excited to get this additional webinar started. I'm going to give it just a couple more minutes to let the room fill in, but we'll start it here very, very soon. This is our seventh now webinar in support of Oregon Wine Month. And we really, really value everybody's time and attention, and the folks that have been coming back week after week. We really appreciate it. We're excited today to talk about sustainability. Here in Oregon, it's very near to everybody's heart. It's not necessarily a buzzword. It's something that we practice, preach, and incorporate into our lives. Bree's going to introduce the panel, but before we do so, I just wanted to do a couple housekeeping things. Again, everybody's muted, but we will be watching the chat and the Q&A. So if there's questions as we go through the presentation, please fill the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. And I also wanted to make note of an educational opportunity. The Oregon Wine Board has partnered with the Napa Valley Wine Academy, and they have just updated their Oregon Wine Expert course to include the new ABAs. So we have partnered with them, and we will be providing a couple trade scholarships to this course. I'm going to put some information in the chat about the course itself, which is a very valuable educational resource. And what we're going to do is we're just going to take a look at all the participants over the last 6 and now 7 weeks. And randomly pick a couple candidates to enroll into that course as an appreciation from the Oregon Wine Board. So I'll get to that here in just a second. And then also, as a follow-up to all of these webinars that we've been doing, we may reach out to folks within a questionnaire just to get some feedback and some recommendations so that when we reboot this in 2023, we continue to bring you relevant and interesting educational opportunities. And so maybe keep an eye out for that. And if you want to be reached or contacted, feel free to email me too, and we can make sure to get a dedicated questionnaire out to you. I'll put my email in the chat as well. All right, I think I covered everything. I'm going to turn it over to Bree Stock, Director of Education for the Oregon Wine Board. Bree, thanks for getting this panel together. I can already tell it's going to be a lot of fun. Please take it away.
Thanks, David. And yes, if everyone's looking for any previous webinars, you can find them on the trade website as well. And David will give you a little bit more information again at the end about the new or the renewed Napa Valley Wine Academy Oregon Wine Export course as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump in really quickly and just give you a little background on the history of sustainability in Oregon. Generally speaking, I would say the Oregon winemakers have always been driven to capture the natural beauty and distinct character of this beautiful state in a glass of wine. Over the years, Oregon's wine growers and makers have joined together to preserve the land and protect it for generations to come. The Oregon wine industry was really born into a culture of sustainability because Oregon as a state has had a long time commitment to protecting the environment and preserving its natural resources. This commitment to sustainability dates back to 1889 when the state legislature enacted Oregon's first environmental law prohibiting pollution of waters used for domestic or livestock purposes. In 1966, Oregonians then elected an innovative governor, Tom McCall, who enacted key environmental legislation to protect Oregon's environment and natural resources. In 1971, Oregon was the first state to pass the nation's first bottle bill, implementing refunds on soft drink, beer, water containers, and reducing litter and increasing recycling. In 1973, Oregon State Legislature Bill 100 created an institutional structure for statewide urban planning, and it required cities and counties to adopt comprehensive land use plans and place restrictions on urban sprawl into farmland. The state's early winemakers, Oregon represented not just an ideal place to grow grapes, grow families. It represented a frontier where wine growers could really practice their trade in a biologically diverse and ecologically balanced way. They produce high quality wine, but they do it in a synergy with nature while upholding the responsibility as stewards of the land. As you can see from this slide, we're pretty committed. 47% of vineyards are certified sustainable. It's one of the largest in the country for wine growing, and 52% of wine is made from estate grown fruit. So everyone's really connected to protecting the land that they're working on and living on and taking fruit from, and protecting that land for future generations. If you turn over a bottle of Oregon wine, these are some of the logos that you might see on a bottle of Oregon wine. And I'll touch on these very quickly and then let the panel take it away. So B Corp is that first logo there. It's a sustainability for basically business sustainability and a commitment from the business to have the best practices for their staff, for the land, and for the natural resources as possible. DRC is the Dry Roots Coalition, which is a group of wine growers who are committed to only purchasing or making wine from fruit and vineyards that are non-irrigated, so dry grown, so Deep Roots Coalition. And then Demeter Biodynamic Certification. So this is a more of a holistic vineyard certification, healing the planet through agriculture. And it was informally established in the 1920s, but formally established in 1985. And Oregon has some of the most certified biodynamic vineyard land in all of the US. LIVE is the Pacific Northwest certification for low input viticulture and enology standards, and it covers both vineyards and wineries, and the relationship between protecting the land and also all of the waterways around it, which is where Salmon Safe comes in as well. Salmon Safe transforming land management practices so that Pacific salmon can thrive on the West Coast. And then USDA Organic and Oregon Tilth are the two organic certifications. And one of the newest organic certifications is the Regenerative Organic Certification, which one of our panelists knows very intimately, as they became Oregon's first Regenerative Organic Certified winery and vineyard. So as you can see, Oregon is very committed to sustainability certifications and beyond. There's many vineyards and wineries who are practicing these philosophies and beyond, and really exploring what it means to protect the place that they live and work on, and how they can leave it better for the next generation. My panel are those future farmers who are really pushing the boundaries of what it means to have a sustainable agricultural system and a healthy relationship with your vineyard and your wines. I have Garret Long from Troon Vineyards, who is the Director of Farming and Biodynamics at Troon. And I also have Stephen Hagen from Antiquum Farm, who is farmer first and foremost, but owner of Antiquum, and really pretty inspirational in some of the work that Stephen is doing around land management with regards to climate change and wildfire impacts. And I'm excited to let him tell you all about that work that he's doing as well. And then someone who needs no introductions is Mimi Casteel. I gave her the title of recovering ecologist because that's what she claims more than not. But she is one of the most inspiring wine growers and makers here in our valley, always looking forward down the road and pushing the boundaries and taking her message all over the world as well. So I'm excited to have this incredible group here today. We also have Andrew Smith, who's the winemaker at Antiquum Farm, who's also going to help out in the chat because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions as well. So welcome all of you. Garret, I would like to welcome you. Garret's a soil scientist from UC Davis, and has a long history with recovering landscapes. Garret, tell us a little bit about why land and soil management is so important to you.
Yeah, thank you, Bree, and thanks for everybody for joining us this afternoon. As Bree said, I'm Garret Long. I'm the Director of Agriculture at Troon Vineyard here in the Applegate Valley of Southern Oregon. I started here actually just last August and just kind of jumped into the raging river that is harvest time. And I will be the first to admit it was my first wine harvest that I've ever worked. I've worked in biodynamic agriculture and regenerative organic certified for about the last 10 years. But this is one of my early experiences in viticulture, and why I was asked to join the future farming panel. I will hopefully share with you, despite my lack of experience with viticulture. And we're kind of starting off with what an image that might seem kind of confrontational to some people. This was actually made by a nonprofit called Kiss the Ground and a really wonderful artist who painted it in LA. And I wanted to sort of compare this literal across the fence comparison that exists on many of the lands that we own, manage, steward. Our neighbors are not always immediately on board, and sometimes there can be this really stark contrast, literally across the fence in this case. And I think one of my hopes and goals as a farmer and as an educator is to try and share with people who maybe at first glance this seems like a confusing, complex, too difficult sort of system to manage, how all of these seemingly unrelated enterprises within a diversified farming system can all end up relating to each other and supporting each other, and how diversity really tends to breed resilience within agriculture and within ecology. A little bit, I guess, about my journey here to Troon. I started, as I mentioned, about 10 years ago. Well, maybe I'll one step further back. I studied biology in college. I've always been interested in the intersection of plants and animals and ecology and climate and all of these things. And went to a liberal arts school, and my kind of first opportunity after graduating with a whole bunch of debt from a private liberal arts school was going to volunteer and woof on a farm in Southern California called Apricot Lane Farms. A couple years ago, there's a documentary called The Biggest Little Farm that was released about that farm. And I had the really fortunate experience to get my feet wet, actually have my first experience in agriculture and really fall in love with soil and fall in love with farming as a result of being there for about 5 years. It was while I was there that I really started to make some of the connections between all these really diverse systems, and realized that to me, soil really is the intersection of all of those things that I'm passionate about. All of these waste streams, be it manure or weeds that we pull out of the garden or fruit that rots in the field, whatever it might be, all of this waste inevitably can go back to the compost, and it's processed by microorganisms. It's cycled and it's broken down into those little individual building blocks of life. And it's essentially the source of regeneration, as I see it, is all of these, tiny microorganisms that are literally underfoot, often forgot about, but are the reason why there's not just piles and piles of dead things all covering the planet right now, are actually attributable to all the bacteria and fungi and the other microscopic organisms that we live with. And it was while I was there farming at Apricot Lane that I started to make these connections and really see how beautiful and virtuous this cycle of regeneration is, and how it's really driven by soil and the microbes in it. And it led me to want to pursue that further and attend UC Davis. I did my master's in soils and biogeochemistry there, and then have continued on with my farming experience. So I've worked on a couple of different biodynamic certified farms since then, as well as now at Troon, we have become Regenerative Organic Certified. And I think that, to touch on Demeter and that certification, what really sets that apart, I actually wrote down a quote in preparation for this, and it's by a Japanese farmer named Masanobu Fukuoka. Anybody who read One Straw Revolution might be familiar with his work, but I really like it. The quote is, "The ultimate goal of farming is not the growing of crops, but the cultivation and perfection of human beings." And while that might not make a lot of sense from maybe an economic standpoint, or even just at first glance, I think what I've come to understand through biodynamics, through the making and the use of the biodynamic preparations, and by farming for more than a decade in harmony with these seasonal rhythms, doing different practices at certain times of year, what I've really come to understand is that we as human beings are not apart from nature. You know, it sounds cliche, but we are a part of nature. We are just one of the many, many organisms that share this planet, be it plants, animals, microbes, whatever. And we all interact, we're all interconnected. We're all sharing the same air and water. And the biodynamic preparations are a requirement within the biodynamic certification, but they're one of the many things that that are a part of that certification. You know, a good 90-95% of it are some of these practices that we'll get into a little bit today. Those practices are, you know, making and using compost. The materials from those compost are generated on your farm. There's really this idea within biodynamic systems and regenerative systems to close the loop, you know, to really not just utilize those waste streams on your farm, but actually try to minimize those inputs from off farm and to really build fertility from within the farm. And what I've realized, what I've witnessed actually, is that gets better and better every single year as you layer on compost made from your grape pumice and from your animal manures and from those weeds on your farm. And that sort of unique signature, biological, chemical, dare I say, even sort of spiritual signature from your farm is reflected in the qualities really of your farm, of your fruit, and of the culture. And I think that as much as we'd all, I'm sure, love to move beyond certifications and really take a look at practices, take a look at some of the data that we can collect on our farms, you know, analyze the soil, look at metrics of soil health, like soil organic matter or carbon, or the diversity of microorganisms that we see in our soils or in our wines. That as much as we'd like to move beyond that, one of I think the real benefits of certifications is that they provide a roadmap for transitioning. And it can feel really overwhelming when you start to think about all of these diverse practices. How are they related? How many people am I going to need to hire to run this thing and comply with all this certification, this paperwork? And it can be a heavy lift, but what the standards, be it Demeter, biodynamic, regenerative organic, or any of those other certifications, sustainability certifications, they do provide a roadmap to farmers, and they do provide a touchstone for consumers. You know, there is a certain amount of accountability that is understood by consumers, and I think that can really benefit the overall conversation, as sort of basic or maybe simplistic as it is. One of the other things that it's done for Troon is to provide a sort of or it informs our company culture. Really, you know, we can always be referencing back to the standards and say, you know, we treat our animals with the best welfare possible. We, as one of the pillars of the regenerative organic certification, is this farmer and farm worker fairness, or the sort of social fairness pillar that requires that, you know, our folks have year-round employment. They're making a living wage for our area. They have benefits, they have good quality jobs, and there is a pathway for clear communication and conflict resolution. This is actually built into the certifications, and it is really one of those things that sets ROC apart from any of the other sustainability certifications. And I think lastly, one of the reasons why we've chosen to get certified, not just with organic and regenerative organic, but also biodynamic, is that it provides these milestones for celebration. And by achieving these milestones, we can look back and say, you know what, we were ROC silver. There's a bronze, silver, and gold standard that you can get certified as. And we started out as silver currently. We hope to attain gold and ROC gold this fall. And it's this opportunity to celebrate this as a company and further instill that celebration into our company culture. So I think these are some of the reasons why we've chosen to become certified, but ultimately we're conducting soil health monitoring over long-term periods. We're actually following up on our baseline soil studies that we took 4 years ago. This month, actually, in the end of this month, we're going to be collecting those soil samples, and we'll be able to look back, 10 years from now and look at how our farming practices have influenced these different measures of soil health, of water holding capacity, of biodiversity, of carbon sequestration, of our reduced independence on those outside inputs, be it diesel and fuel for our equipment, fertilizers, even bringing in manure from a neighboring organic dairy farm that we build a lot of our compost out of. We'd love to be able to take a step back on all of those outside inputs and really just focus in, double down on building that fertility from within the farm. And as I kind of move to wrap up, I mean, well, two things. One, I want to make sure that it doesn't go unsaid that soil is alive. This is so often, I think, forgot about in agriculture, and especially for folks who don't work within agriculture. There's not a recognition for it's dirt. It's not alive. It's literally just what you sweep up off of your floor. But there's a really staggering statistic that there's more organisms in just a handful or a tablespoon of healthy soil than there are people on the planet. And if you think about the incredible capacity for soil to breed life and to prevent disease, and ultimately, from healthy soil grows healthy crops. These healthy crops are eaten by healthy animals and people. As Fukuoka was saying, for the betterment and the perfection of the human being, we form more healthy, better societies and cultures, and ultimately planetary health is linked to our ultimately back to soil health. And I think that all starts with those living, breathing organisms that contribute so much to sustainability. And then I guess the last thing that I just want to address here is why I'm on this panel without much of a background in viticulture, yet here telling you about the future of farming in Oregon viticulture, Oregon wine. Despite my background or lack of background in wine growing, I do have a background in fruit and orcharding, in vegetable gardening, in livestock and poultry, in making compost and making the biodynamic preparations that you see here. And it's all of these diverse enterprises, practices that are all married harmoniously on this 100-acre farm, this piece of land that we're all tending and stewarding together. And it's with all of the confluence of all of those practices that really breeds soil health, it breeds biodiversity, and it breeds that culture that so often gets talked about in wine as terroir, right? That representation of place. Well, I think that representation or that place is not just the soil and the climate, but it's actually the people and the culture who are tending the land, and what are their values and what are their morals. And so I think as we kind of look toward the future of farming, something that I want to impress upon people is that it does require this moral fiber. It requires a dedication to steward the land, to really challenge yourself when you're faced with failure, with challenges, and with pests and disease and economic hardship. It's not easy being a farmer. And I think it takes a village, as they say. It takes a whole community. And I just want to really encourage and challenge everybody to think about all of these diverse enterprises and how they can all unite to support one another on a farm and support soil health ultimately. So that's basically all I had to say today. I'm really interested to also hear what Stephen and Mimi have to say. So thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, Garret. And I love listening to Garret. He's such a natural educator, and he's just so truly passionate about the soil and about creating healthy ecosystems. And, everything that he says is true. And coming from the winemaking side, I personally gravitate towards organic and biodynamically, regeneratively farmed vineyards because in the cellar, they have a lot more life in them. They have a lot more nutrients there that I don't need to then have to adjust in the cellar. And so if you're doing the work in the vineyard, you know, that's that cliche that is great wines made in the vineyard. But it really is, if you don't have to add anything to it in the cellar because of how nutrient rich it is, and the yeast can thrive, and you're bringing in the healthy population of yeast on with those grapes into the cellar. That's really such a, you know, intimate connection with that place. And to what Garret was saying, it's that really true expression of terroir, and of the place. And often why, you know, wines taste differently is because when you don't have to get in there and you know, touch them up, so to speak, you know, they do taste differently. They taste of their own sense of place. And if anyone is ever in the Rogue Valley, you should all visit the Rogue Valley. Troon is putting so much work into building an amazing educational experience around. There's a fantastic biodynamic garden. They've planted all their own biodynamic prep plants that they need. When I was there, Garret was, you know, bringing in new sheep, and little lambs were being born. It was amazing. And so it's truly a place to visit and really immerse yourself and understand what these movements are about, and really be connected to the place and connected to the wine that you're drinking. And more we're all looking for, you know, putting our money and you know, beliefs and energy behind products that have purpose, and that's certainly what they're doing down at Troon, and the wines are delicious as well. So thank you, Garret. I would love now to have Stephen, who is in the Willamette Valley, but in the southern part of the Willamette Valley, just outside of Eugene, in one of the newest AVAs, the Lower Long Tom AVA. Stephen has been farming at Antiquum Farm for many years, and has had an incredible journey and experience through his farming practices, and basically self-taught, right? Stephen, tell me how you, I love watching, everyone needs to follow Antiquum Farmer Instagram, because it is like the best morning, you know, like coffee wake up of your life. You just feel good after seeing that stuff. He's there hugging pigs, and it's amazing. Stephen, can you tell us a little bit about your beautiful piece of property and how you got to this place, this regenerative farming space, without following certifications?
Right. Correct. Yeah. Thanks, Bree. And thank you, Garret. That was awesome and really inspiring. Makes me realize I need to get my act together a little bit. Yeah. So I'm a local kid. I actually grew up just over the ridge and down the road. So 4 miles away from this place. This property was actually a place that I trespassed all over when I was a kid. And I had, in the 1970s and early 1980s, what I would describe as a pretty feral childhood out here, as we were able to do and allowed to do back then. And it was pretty amazing, and spent a lot of time. I mean, spent all my time outside hunting, fishing, roaming around. A big pack of kids in this neighborhood. You know, we all had horses, bicycles, dirt bikes, you know, whatever our parents would let us get away with. And we roamed around in a big pack out here. We were gone overnight outside a lot. You know, by the time when I was 10 years old, my parents gave me a 12-gauge shotgun and a horse and turned me loose. That freedom, and that sense of place in this community, it informs my self-identity and gives me a sense of belonging to this place that informs my farming decisions 40 years later. So that just sort of innate knowledge and sense of belonging to place is something that I really wanted to bring to our farming when my wife Nikki and I came up from Southern California and purchased this property. There really was no business plan to this. We knew nothing about wine. We knew nothing about vineyards. We started this for all the wrong reasons. We got into this just because we thought it would look pretty and it would be romantic and just really ignorant ideas about what this thing was. It turns out, I feel like this was actually what I was meant to do. And up until the time I was about 25 years old, I was kind of spinning my wheels. So the core thing that actually drives the way that we farm is how we wanted to raise our children and the principles that we hope to instill in them and to give them a sense of that same sense of belonging, same sense of community and some work ethic, hopefully some humility. And those were really like, that was the core statement of the business model, if there was going to be one written down. So early on, when we first started developing the vineyard, I kept hearing about this concept of terroir, and I didn't really get it. I got what people were saying. I got that wine has this unique ability to reflect place and time. And everyone always spoke about it just kind of in terms of climate and soil. Those were kind of the two legs of terroir. And I kept looking at how people were farming. And although I knew nothing about farming, it didn't make sense to me to be saying that you make something that reflects place, but at the same time, you're bringing things in from outside. So you're using fertilizers or whatever you're doing, whether they're organic or conventional. That didn't make sense to me, because as I started looking at where those materials are coming from, number one, they aren't from your farm. They certainly aren't from your vineyard site. And in most cases, they're coming from all the way across the country. So even if you're using certified organic fertilizers, which, I'll be the first person to say, like, positive step, and something everybody should be doing if you're using conventional fertilizers. Make that transition today. But that you're trucking something across the country in the name of sustainability. And not only are you kind of undermining the idea of sustainability, you're also using a material that everyone else is using. The source points for those materials are incredibly limited. And so not only are you using the same fertilizer that your neighbor is using, but you're using the same stuff that, the guy who's growing whatever in Minnesota, or someone, growing broccoli out in Washington State or whatever. So it just didn't make sense to me. I didn't get it. We did not have the space or we didn't have the land on this farm to begin some kind of enterprise where, we didn't have 1,000 acres where we could raise forage and feed that forage to animals, collect that material, and build giant compost piles to sustain our vineyard. We're a 140 acre farm with 20 acres under vine. So I had to start thinking about, if we're going to actually do this, if we're really going to drill into the concept of terroir and make it real, not just something that we're talking about, we've got to figure out a way to farm this place in a way that is completely self-contained. So from the very beginning, we started with initially in early years on the vineyard with sheep in the vineyard during the dormant season. And I really quickly decided that we had to move to having animals in the vineyard year round. And that is where all the work really begins, and all of the innovation and all the heartache and headache and trial and error over the years. So over time, we've developed this system that I call grazing-based viticulture. the vineyard has not received any kind of fertilization whatsoever for about 15 years. And what we're doing now is using rotational intensive grazing methods in the vineyard, using sheep, pigs, geese, turkeys, chickens, and quite a few dogs. And the dogs are there just to keep them safe. What I was not expecting was what began to happen to our soils as we built up the microbiome of our soils. I was expecting that, because as we're rotating through the vineyard, what's happening is, you know, you look at these slides up here and you see forage heights that are quite tall. And earlier in the season, when the forage is growing quickly, as the forage grows, you have above ground biomass that's being built. But you're also building below ground biomass in the root mass of the plants. Every time that you graze that material off, that root mass dies off and recedes to match that reduction in biomass. And that root zone die-off that's happening is stimulating a microbial population. Now, you're also doing that in the absence of fertilization, of any kind of homogenizing fertilizer, any kind of compost. So essentially your microbial population is being thrown out on an island. It's being completely isolated. So it has to adapt. It has to be able to cope with the resources that it's being given. So it changes, it mutates, it evolves over time. And those microbes are what are responsible for breaking down the insoluble nutrients that are inherently present in our soils. So they are now taking over completely the job of feeding these vines instead of sort of force feeding, injecting soluble fertilizers. So over time, the vines, how they're eating, what they're eating, what they're being fed shifts over time. And Pinot varietals being genetically unstable over time, the vines themselves have changed. So that's what we found is these farming methods have had a profound effect on our wines over time. Like the vines themselves look different, they grow different, the fruit is different colors. And you know, there are many things about our wine that you know, our Pinot Gris kind of at this point in many ways ain't Pinot Gris anymore. And that to me leads to a really interesting discussion about wine and about terroir, that I think a lot of times when we get locked into preconceived ideas about, you know, this varietal from this area of the valley and it should be like this, or even pursuing that style, I think you're already maybe kind of missing a really important part of the conversation. I don't care. I love my home. I love Oregon. I love the Willamette Valley. I love my winemaking community. I do not care about making Willamette Valley Pinot Noir. I care about making the most beautiful, honest, truthful wine that comes from Antiquum Farm. And I take just as much pride in the terroir of my lamb, of my chickens, of my eggs, as I do in my wines. I see them all as equally important. They are not, you know, this isn't about a vineyard so much. There are vines out there, but the vines are, not to sound too hippy-dippy about it, but the vines are part of a community. They have a place in it. They are not the whole show. So what's been really fascinating to watch as the vineyard has evolved is like this vineyard behind me is all Pinot Gris. It is all one clone planted on one rootstock, because back when I was planting the vineyard, I didn't know that that's a bad idea. So that's what we got, because that's what we were offered. What's been really cool to see, despite the fact that this is only a 6-acre footprint, all one clone, all one rootstock, is that different areas of the vineyard have started expressing in completely different ways, to the point where we can't even make the same wines. You know, one of our wines, Andrew, does a fully skin fermented Pinot Gris. Another one, we do a little bit of skin contact. Another one, we make white wine. And that isn't because, oh, we can go out and the public demands this wine, or orange wine is hot right now, or whatever. It's that if we try to make white wine from these first 10 or 12, it's only 10 or 12 rows, it's ridiculously small. It's 320 plants. It's absolutely stupid. But if we were trying to make white wine from that fruit, it would be disgusting. It'd be all knees and elbows and sharp edges, and it would not be fun. Same thing with the other side of the field. Everything is presenting us with completely different circumstances, and we are just receiving that information and reacting to it in our winemaking.
I love that. And it is really such a special place down there. And the wines are incredibly distinctive. But you completely understand the approach and why it makes so much sense when you're standing in the vineyard, watching the sheep do their thing, the pigs, the geese, and it just feels so healthy and alive. And you see that energy and life and flavor in the wines as well. And Stephen, I'm going to jump to in 2020, we, like much of the West Coast, was impacted by wildfires. And you, as you can see here, everyone, completely surrounded by forest, right? This is what much of Oregon looks like, especially when you're like the lower Long Tom AVA, which is buffered into the Coast Range. So the foothills of the Coast Range, completely surrounded by forest. And so having all of this forest and life around you, in 2020, when the wildfires came through, they definitely impacted your site, but it got you thinking about, I was fascinated by this. It really got you thinking about your entire property and how you could be a little bit more, I guess, engaged in that healthy management or forest reclamation. Can you walk us through a little bit and tell us the story behind your forest floor project?
Yes. Growing up here, wildfire season was not a thing. And I think back to just not all that long ago, we had this little sweet spot for a few years where field burning for grass seed fields wasn't allowed any longer. And before wildfire season became an annual tradition here in the West. We had this little sweet spot where, oh my gosh, in August you can look out and see the Coburg Hills on the other side of the valley, and that is no longer our reality. And it feels like it's something that is going to be dependable. It's going to be here to stay. And fixing this problem, even if we were to right now press a button and start moving our forest management systems back into something that creates forest systems that are naturally capable of dealing with wildfire, we're 150 years out if we press the button today to do everything right. And in the meantime, what we're really doing is pointing fingers at each other and arguing about it. And that, that makes me incredibly sad. But finding the hope in that, I'd been thinking about this for quite a while and negotiating in my marriage to make certain moves on the farm and things like that in order to implement this program. And we are still just getting going with it. But as you can see in this slide, there's some pretty dramatic differences already in a few areas. So what we're looking to do is kind of two different tactics, because as you saw from the previous slide, we are completely surrounded by forest. Our two vineyards are actually separated by a ridge that is it's all north facing. It's entirely forested. Our homes, our barns, our workshops, our tasting room. When a fire happens here, it's an incredibly dangerous and financially it's an existential threat to our livelihood. So two different ways that we're looking at this. So the slide on your right here is an area that I'm going to call a human interface zone. So this is just maybe about 50 yards away from our home. So there's this large north-facing slope that was just filled up with blackberries and Scotch broom and all kinds of brush and things like that. So in those areas, what we're doing is going through, making sure that the trees are spaced out to where a fire could not spread from crown to crown, getting those trees limbed up so that you don't have those ladder fuels that allow a fire that's on the ground where it should be to climb up into the forest canopy and then allow that fire to blow up. So the process that we're doing is, so on a piece of ground like this with those blackberries, those will be, in the center there, maybe 8 feet tall. So we're using goats and cooney pigs. The cooney pigs late season, they love this work because there's all kinds of blackberries and things like that. So as the goats are going through defoliating those blackberries, they're the leaves off of the blackberry vines, they're knocking the berries off, and the pigs are getting fat on them right before, acorns are going to drop in another month, and then we get windfall apples, and the pigs just really plump up for us in fall. So in those areas, what we do here in a place like this is go through with a weed whacker with a brush blade and just cut a series of paths through it so that the goats can get into the middle of it and start working outward. And what they'll do is completely pick all the leaves off of those vines. That takes away the plant's ability to build up reserves to overwinter. And then once they finish that, we go back through and mow it completely down to the ground. And so now, this time of year, as they're re-emerging, they send up this nutritious, delicious, tender, and very, very vulnerable growth. And we send the goats back through, and they just nip those off. We rotate them on, move them on, just like how we move the livestock through the vineyard. We move those and keep them moving, and we just never allow those plants to get up. And eventually what happens is their root reserves get exhausted and the blackberries die. So this area in the slide on the right is now already a beautiful grassy pasture. So here's a before and after of another area just above our home. In the slide on the left, you can see some of those pathways that we've cut through to give the goats a little better access. And then on the right is just after where we went back through, cut the canes down to the ground, seeded back in grass and clover and herbs and things like that, and then gave it a little mulch, and away it went. And this spring, it's a gorgeous little pasture. You can see that on our Instagram account if you check that out. So those are the human interface zones. The forest zones are a little different in that we're not looking at spacing out trees or things like that. We're looking instead at managing non-native invasive species on the forest floor. So the first slide that Bree showed you was a great example of this. So that's actually, it's not from precisely so the next one back, Bree. Yeah, that one. So not from exactly the same vantage point, but this is the exact same area only about 7 months after we began. So on the left, you have non-native invasive blackberries completely choking out the forest floor. Nothing except for small rodents, reptiles, and insects and birds can use this. Larger animals simply cannot access this area for anything. So one of the really beautiful things about this is after you go through and do this work and then begin maintaining it, is you see a much greater diversity of wildlife returning to the forest and utilizing that space. So not only are we making some wonderful goat curry and some, and pork shoulder out of this, but also the wildlife is getting back and is able to use this space again. And when a fire does occur, fire can move through the property and not get into canopy and not blow up. And it's work that really makes my heart sing. It's new for us, but I just love it. The difference is so dramatic, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it looks amazing, and it's just so interesting, so insightful, and you can feel the connection that you have to this place and the care and love that you have for this place when you're at the vineyard and around it. And it's just very inspirational, and I'm not at all surprised that you're continuing down this path from where your vineyard journeys left. And I know that Mimi Casteel is also one of these people who is very connected and committed to conversations about maintaining animal habitat pathways and highways for as the Willamette Valley becomes more heavily vineyard populated. It becomes less of it starts to become more of a monoculture of the vine. And Mimi Casteel was one of the first people that I met in Oregon many years ago who was doing this work and actually having conversations about regeneration. And I believe, Mimi, it started when you returned to your family's farm. You grew up in the Eola Amity Hills, AVA. Your parents were some of the first founding vineyard and winemakers in the Eola Amity Hills in the Willamette Valley, in the North Willamette Valley. And you grew up roaming those vineyards and forest lands. And when you returned from actually the forest industry where you worked for many years, you returned to vines that weren't in the best condition. And you, like Stephen, sort of applied some of this knowledge that you'd been working with. And you're now on a completely, immersed in journey. Can you tell us, get us up to speed on where you are and how you got to this place, why you're at this place?
Well, it's a tough act to follow with both of those gentlemen who came before me, and I definitely resonate with Stephen's upbringing. It was back when parenting could be more of a hobby and less of a full-time helicopter job like it is now. So I very much had a very similar experience where your first bond is really with wild nature. And the reason I became a forest ecologist was because those were the systems that I felt most comfortable in. And when I was working in forest systems and really thinking about those ecosystems, I could not help but think about farming, because that was the background that I came from and how we do it, and why the research that I was doing in the forest was suggesting that these very protected, kind of locked up ecosystems were still trending in a backwards direction. And we are still losing those places. And it's because of how we do agriculture. It's because there is no support coming from the much more vast landscape that is privately owned and privately held and privately managed. And so coming back to Bethel Heights, my family were amongst the first people to really start thinking about sustainability in agriculture, especially in viticulture. They had, own rooted vines planted in the late 70s and very much starting to, think about replanting, because phylloxera had been a known entity in the valley for a while. And so when my cousin Ben and I came back to Bethel Heights, there was this sort of moment where and there was a lot of excitement around that moment, that we would replant those own rooted old vines. And yet, nobody could deny that in the cellar, those were the wines those were the thumbprints for our place. Those were the wines that we came to know Pinot Noir by, and still hands down the best wines we had in the cellar. And so I got pretty obsessed with this idea of trying to take what I know about systemic function and immune function in a forested ecosystem to a perennial woody plant that's being grown as an agricultural commodity, basically. And really started throwing myself at just various experiments with biodynamics, with different teas that I would make, and then building diversity. And the main thing that I really couldn't get my head around was the cultivation that we were doing very regularly, because we were worried about a competitive threat from the vineyard floor, some competition really being in the way of ripening trajectories, et cetera. And so, going ambitiously towards no-till and really sort of focusing on the systemic health of the system, not necessarily trying to attack symptoms at the vine level, but really trying to attack the system as a whole and rebuild it. That was where I started the journey. And along the way, really started to appreciate how as diversity grows, I mean, if you think about it, more than 95% of terrestrial life, more than 95% of life on land is below this, is below our feet. It's underground, and it's exclusively fed by plant carbon. And so when I think about terroir, and this is one of my things too, if we're even going to use that word, that biological component of that place where we think we can do something only here, if you're here to make wine, I mean, it's a luxury product, right? Let's not kid ourselves about that. If we're going to grow wine somewhere, you better think that the wine that's in your heart can only be made there. And if that's true, the first thing we do is go and remove everything that was there. Everything that was feeding, everything that was there is gone in an instant. And then we go about, dosing in the things that we think the plants need when we think they need it, when in fact, there is no precedent for that in wild nature. There is no way to make the most robust expression of place without all of those components, and particularly the living components of place. So that is, and I'm trying to be, because I know it's like almost time, so I want to make sure people can get their questions answered, but that's my fastest route here.
Yeah, I think the first time that I actually met Mimi at Bethel Heights, she dragged me into a barn and made me stick my hand into compost that had like dung and beetles and worms and everything, your vermiculture pile, and it was the most unique vineyard visit that I'd had today.
Welcome to Oregon.
Right? Welcome to Oregon. But it's true. It's that reflection of place, and the biodiversity has to be part of that. The biology and biodiversity has to be part of that conversation for it to be a meaningful glass of wine, and not an industrial product. And there's plenty of industrial wine out there. You just can't do that to the same extent on these small plots of land as well. So making meaningful wine is really what so many here are about. And I do have some questions in the chat as well. There's a question from Howard, who's asking, can a couple of you, or Mimi, can you talk about some sustainable approaches to vine row weed and pest management in the systems that you're talking about?
Sure. And I think the guys will have something to say about this too. But, to me, we think about, we say the word weed, and even when we're talking about invasive species, all plants that are growing are doing photosynthesis. They're doing you a favor. And so when I think about plants that I don't particularly like, or maybe that, could potentially grow into the canopy, we try to manage that as much as possible with animals, because that herbivory stimulation, like Stephen was saying, that does stimulate a carbon pathway that is otherwise unstimulated if you just let plants grow in the absence of herbivory. So we try to do that as much as possible and as long into the season as possible. And then, in terms of pests and diseases, what you want to do is build a plant that can produce enough secondary plant metabolites, so enough secondary compounds and chemicals that are naturally repellent to the biggest pests of Vitis vinifera. Now, the one big nut we have yet to crack, or at least I have yet to crack in a very sensitive system, is powdery mildew. So we do still use our own our organic spray program is really only for that one pest, but we have clonally selected this particular organism, not to be resistant, but to, produce this grape that we're also infatuated with. So that is the one thing. And I have noticed that in an organic spray program, once you can get a system built that is capable of producing those secondary plant metabolites, your spray burden is much lower. But I'm not going to pretend like we don't still spray. I mean, it is Vitis vinifera. It is so sensitive. And I think one of the conversations that needs to be had in the wine world is, what is the level of, sanitation in the canopy that makes sense to keep the fruit clean while still being able to feel okay about how many passes you're making in your vineyard for your spray program. And I don't think we talk enough about that. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I would echo everything that Mimi just said, which I'd like to just make a career on that. This feels like a very safe place to be. But I'd specifically like to talk about, part of the question was about vine row weed management. And so at Antiquum Farm, we're always, the goal is always to have absolutely no tillage. That is not always a possibility. Sometimes we are presented with conditions and on these incredibly thin, very worn soils that we have here. Sometimes we do have to do a little bit of cultivation in row. But our goal every year is to be grazing that and to not touch it, because I'm not very keen on tillage, and that tillage does create atmospheric carbon release and does disrupt the microbial populations that we're working so hard to be in partnership with. So as much as possible, we're always trying to reduce tillage. There are practices industry-wide in regards to tillage. This sort of accepted practice that it's groovy, good organic farming to be, tilling up, disking up the vineyard alleyways every year, going through several passes with the S-tine, with a soil conditioner, smooth everything out so that your back doesn't have to suffer. And our backs are for suffering. That's what they're there for. But that all of that, and then going back and drilling in cover crops to create these big biomass crops that then are mowed down and tilled back in the next year. And that's an accepted practice as something that is really great farming, is groovy, creates a lot of carbon release, uses a lot of fuel. So we're always trying to come back to the same viewpoint that we are with our sheep and with our pigs. Raising pigs here on the farm that don't need to be fed. When I tell people that raise pigs that we don't feed our pigs, I get called a liar a lot. We're in the same way that we're trying to raise animals that thrive through the growing season on the conditions that we have here on the farm. It's the same thing that we're looking at for our vineyard floor. We want to help along and facilitate the presence of plant life in the vineyard that stands up to and thrives in the system that we have, so that over time this place just becomes more and more true and self-sustaining.
Well, I think that if nothing else, the Oregon wine industry is certainly in good hands with the three of you at the helm. And I love the, Oregon farmers, Oregon wine growers, continually changing the perception of farming and questioning the practices and altering, returning these landscapes into better pieces of land than what they once were. And I think that's what so many here are really, wanting to connect with and are really working hard for. We've got one other question that came in from Florent. He says there's for the French reader, there's a fascinating book by Gerard Ducerf that describes plants and their direct influence on the soil and why they thrive in soil. They can be an indicator of soil balance or imbalance, certain plants. So anyone out there who wants to do a little more digging as well, thanks Florent for that tip, appreciate it. Any other questions out there before I let all of these amazing farmers get back to their farms, because they're nothing if not incredibly busy people. It's been a real pleasure talking with you all, and I hope that everyone on here feels a little more comfortable now with some of the conversations and words that are starting to get talked about from a winemaking perspective or a wine sales perspective. Concepts like biodynamic wine, biodynamic farming, regenerative practices, all of your stories paint such a deep picture for why people are doing this work and why there is good to be had from doing this work. So I appreciate you all for being here. I know how very busy you are, and I'll let you get back to your farms. Thank you all. Keep up the good fight and keep making great wine.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.
You, Bree.
David.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for the panel for joining us today. Garrett, thank you for helping monitor the chat. We really appreciate everybody's support and attention. And he has a slide there that has information regarding our resource studio, which is a great place to learn about Oregon and our wine industry. I'm also going to put in the chat right now my contact information. Feel free to email me. We'll also try and reach out to gather some information about these webinars. And then if you'd like to see the recording of this, or if you'd like to share it with someone, that link will take you to the recording. We normally post it about a day or two after the webinar. And with that, I will adjourn the final webinar for this year's Oregon Wine Month. Thank you again. Have a great day.